കേൾക്കാം.
സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യാം.
ഹലോ,
ശാലിനി, നമുക്ക് സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യാം. ഓക്കെ,
തുടങ്ങാം.
തുടങ്ങാം.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. I am Shalini. I am the supervisor and editor of LJRF and law exams. I invite everyone to this class meet on international law. So today's topic is sources of international law. This is the second class. First class we had covered the area covering the definitions. Today, Sandeep sir will be taking ahead for the next part of this class. So, with no formal welcome, I invite Sandeep sir. He is the Joint Secretary of LJRF Kerala State Chapter. He completed his graduation and post-graduation from Kerala Law Academy and has specialized in international law. He is also a former member of the Kerala Law Academy Moot Court Society. He worked as an academician for 3 years and has also practiced an advocate for the last 3 years. 3 years. He qualified for his NET exam, and at present he is a research scholar in Novals Kochi. So, welcome you, sir, to this class meet. Before we begin with the for today's class, I invite Abhijit to do a short review of the last class, which was based on the definitions of on the international law. So over to you, Abhijit, for the review class.
Thank you. So, good morning, friends. Am I audible?
Yes, Abhijit, you're on.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Good morning, friends. I am Abhijit. I am from Trivandrum, and in this first session of this weekend, I have prepared a short note on the classes. Last classes, what we Sandeep sir teached us, that is the definitions of international law. And as you can see on the title screen itself, we can see the last class topic, that is definitions of international law. And without wasting time, we are going to a class review of last class. And when we come into the topic, that is the definitions of international law, we can see a timeline in this international law definitions. And again, in this timeline, we can classify these definitions into two, that is old definition and new definition. And this classification has an importance because in this classification, by understanding this classification, we can understand what is the current situation of this international law, what was the situation in the primitive stage of these definitions, and what caused this change from old definition to the new definition of international law. So this classification is helpful for all that. So there are two series of definition, that is old definitions of international law and new definitions of international law. And going to the first definition of international law, and it was given by Jeremy Bentham. We all know that he is a famous jurist, and there is one more importance, that is he coined the term international law. And again, in his book, An Introduction to Principles of Morals and Legislation, that is in 1718, and according to his definition, international law is the law governing the relations between states. So according to him, international law is a law, and again, this law governs the relations between states. It is a definition of Jeremy Bentham. And going to the next definition, and all these next definitions are coming under the series of old definitions. And next definition is given by Lord Coleridge. He's a judicial officer, and he's a judicial officer in King's Bench, England. And he defined international law in a case Kuhn versus Kane. And according to him, international law is collection of usages which civilized states have agreed to observe in their dealings. And I have given a red color to two terms, that is usages and civilized states. And usages, we all know that it is customary rules. And civilized states, this term has an importance because civilized states at that time, in this definition, came in the period of 1870s. At that time, there were two classifications for states, that is civilized states and non-civilized states. And civilized states were only included Christian states. Christian states were only considered as civilized states, and non-Christian states were considered as non-civilized states, and they were not part of this international law. So Lord Coleridge said that this international law is some customary rules that is applicable to civilized states while they are in intercourse with one another country. And next definition that is given by a famous jurist, that is John Austin. We all know him, and it is not a definition. Actually, it's a comment on international law. And his comment on international law is that law is the command of the sovereign backed by sanctions or punishment. But international law doesn't have its own sovereign sanctions or punishment, anything like that. So international law is a part of positive morality. So by this definition, what Austin says that there is no law like international law. International law is a pseudo law because there is no sanctions or punishment for enforcing this international law. So countries obeying this international law only by reason of a positive morality. This is what Austin says about international law. And the next definition, that is, it is the definition given by William Edward Hall. And according to him, international law is some rules of conduct that modern civilized states, again there is a usage of the term civilized states, and the civilized states consider as binding in their relations with another in same nature and degree as a person obey the laws of his country. And it is also enforceable by some means in case of infringement. And in this definition, we can see that the William Edward Hall equals the international law with the domestic law. So the countries obeying the international law like in a way, the person obeys the laws of his country. So this is what William Edward Hall says about international law. And in the second part of this definition, he says that there are some means for enforcing this international law. But we have to understand this, that at that time, that is in 1884, at that time, war was the only means in case of any infringement. This is what William Edward Hall says about international law. Then next definition is given by King's Bench of England, that is given in a famous case, that is Western Central Gold Mining Company Limited versus the King. It is given in 1905, and in that King's Bench says that international law may be defined as the rules accepted by civilized states in determining their conduct towards each other and towards each other's subjects. So there is an importance to this definition. It is because till this definition, the states were the only parties to the international law. But by this definition, individuals were also brought within the ambit of international law, and they are introduced one more branches to the international law, the topic of international law, that is the private international law. That is the importance of this King's Bench of England's definition, that is in the famous case. And next definition is by Justice Gray, and he was a US judge, and in a famous case, that is a Paqueta-Habana case, and it is a case related to the confiscation of a Cuban ship by United States. And Justice Gray states that international law is also known as law of nations is the name of body of rules which, according to the usual definition, regulate the conduct of the civilized states in their intercourse with each other. Next definition is of main importance because it is given by L.F.L. Oppenheim. He was a famous German jurist, and he says about international law that the law of nations is the name for the body of customary and conventional rule, which are considered legally binding by civilized states in their intercourse with each other. So till this definition, there were only one source of international law, that is customary rules of international law. But by this definition, L.F.L. Oppenheim recognizes one more source of international law, that is conventional rules. And again, he says that states obey these rules, that is international law, in a good faith. Good faith. That is the importance of this definition. That is L.F.L. Oppenheim's definition. And then next definition is given by Hackworth in his book, A Digest of International Law in 1906. And he says that international law consists of a body of rules governing the relations between states. And it is a system of jurisprudence which the most parties evolved out of experiences and necessities of situations. So we all know that in domestic law, a customary practice only becomes a law when it is immemorial. But it is not in the case of international law. In international law, the customary practices become law arising out of needs and necessities. It need not be immemorial. That is the importance of the Hackworth's definition. And next definition is by J.J. Brearley, and he says that the law of nations or international law may be defined as the body of rules and principles of action which are binding upon civilized states in their relations with one another. And what is the importance of this definition is that they are recognized two sources till this time, that is the customary rules and conventional rules. And by this definition, J.J. Brearley recognized one more source of international law, that is principles of international law. And coming to the last definition of all series of definitions of international law, that is by Hans Kelsen. And Hans Kelsen's definition is that international law or the law of nations is the body of rules which, according to the usual definition, regulate the conduct of the states in their intercourse with each other. It is the last definition in the whole series of international law. And after this, there has been change from the old definition to the new definition. So we are discussing in these slides what caused these changes from old definition to new definition. I have noted down the first point that is the conducting of international conventions. And the conventions that is conducted in the last period of 19th century, and that is especially saying the Hague Convention, first and second Hague Conventions, that is conducted in 1899 and 1901, is of main importance. And even before the conducting of these conventions, there were agreements. There were bilateral agreements and unilateral agreements were there, but they were lacking the enforcing point. So this lacking of enforcing point caused so many wars. So there needs a really into these definitions of definitions of this international law. And second point I have noted down is that the disappearance of distinction between civilized states and non-civilized states. And third point I have noted down is that by 1914 the World War first started, and after that in 1970 the International Red Cross and NGO received Nobel Prize for Peace. And in 1919, League of Nations and International Labour Organization, which are international organization, was established. So these all incidents needed a really the deep definitions of international law, because these non-state entities and international organizations was part of this international law, became the part of international law. So there needs a change in definitions of international law. So there happened a change in definitions of international law, there came a new series of definitions of international law. And the first definition in that series was the Charles G. Fenwick definition. And he says that international law may be defined as the body of general principles and specific rules which are binding upon the international community. And I have noted down the term international community. The term international community includes international organization, states, non-state entities, even individuals also. So this is the definition that is given by Charles D. Fenwick, and this is given after the World War First, and after that World War Second started in 1939, and in 1944 again International Red Cross received Nobel Prize, and in 1945 they established United Nations Organization instead of League of Nations, and they introduced International Court of Justice. And again going to the new series of definitions of international law, and next is Oppenheim. We have seen the Oppenheim's old series of old definitions of international law. And hello, yes, okay. In this new series of Oppenheim's international law, am I audible? Is it audible?
Yes, Abhijit, you're audible.
Yes. As in this new series, international law, he says that international law is body of rules which are legally binding on states in their intercourse with each other. And this international law is not only applicable to states, but it is applicable to individuals, international organization, and all like that. And this is the new definition of Oppenheim's. And next definition is by William W. Bishop, and he says that international law is a standard of conduct at a given time for states and other entities subject thereto. So international law is not only applicable to states, it is also applicable to non-state entities as well as to individuals. And next definition is that Philip C. Jessup's definition, and in his work A Modern Law of Nations in 1948. And according to him, international law is a law applicable to states in their mutual relations with each other, and also applicable to certain interrelationship of individuals. That is the private international law. That is, we have already mentioned. And the last definition in this new series of international law is that the Stark's definition of international law. And according to him, international law is some principles and rules of conduct which the states feel themselves to be observed, but it is not mandatorily to be observed, but the states commonly observe this. And this contains some rules and regulations relating to international institutions or organizations and their relations with the state and individual. And there are only 2 slides are remaining. That says about the United Nations Charters, some provisions about United Nations Charter, and the distinction between the old definition and new definitions of international law. And in the United Nations Charter, Article 104 says that United Nations Organization, that the UNA will have a legal personality in the territory of its member states. And Article 105, Clause 1 and Clause 2 gives privileges to the United Nations, gives privileges and immunities to the United Nations Organization and to the representatives of the United Nations Organization in the territory of its member states, respectively. And whether a question was decided by ICJ, that is in the last point I have noted down is that reparation of injuries suffered in the service of United Nations. And this is a case that is relating to short death of a Swedish diplomat in the Israel territory. And he was a Swedish diplomat and he was a representative of the United Nations Organization. But Israel was failed to give the privileges and immunities to this Swedish diplomat. So ICJ held that United Nations Organization, which is an international organization, is also coming under the purview of international law. So Israel is liable to give unliquidated damages to United Nations organization. And in the last slide, I have included a table showing what is the difference between this old definition and new definitions of international law. And one of the main difference is that in the old definition, international law only included customary rules and convention, but in the new definition, there is customary rules, principles, and conventions are there. And in the old definition, there were the states were the only subjects in international law. But in the new definition, there is states, international organization, non-state entities are there, even individuals are also there. And in the new old definition, international law governs only considers only the civilized states. In new definition, there is no such distinction. And this is what I understood in the last class. Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Abhijit. That was a very good review class. Sandeep sir, over to you for today's class.
Thank you, Shalini. Thank you, Abhijit, for the wonderful presentation. And I hope the students have received a very brief review of the previous class. The one thing that I would like to add to what Abhijit has stated is, please note the literature that I have mentioned along with the different jurists. I have also mentioned the literature and the year of publication in the last class. I hope all of you have recollected from Abhijit's presentation. So what happens is in the UGC NET exam, these literatures will come as an option. They will ask who stated who used the term international community. That may be a question that may come up. Then where the option may be Charles G. Fenwick, J.L. Brierley, or Oppenheimer. From that option, you have to select Charles G. Fenwick. Okay. Another option that may also come up is the literature. That is, instead of the jurist, the options may ask about in which literature the term international community was first used. So you have to remember, you have to note down the literature that I have noted in the previous class. Literature written by different jurists while they were giving the definition of international law. Okay, so literature and the year of publication and the corresponding jurist and the relevant contribution of those literatures are very important when it comes to UGC NET exam, and they will come up as an option in the MCQ questions. Okay, so please note them down along with appreciating the definition. You also please note down the corresponding literature of the relevant jurist. Okay, with that said, let me go to the our next class. Before we discuss about sources of international law, one thing that we need to discuss is whether international law is a law in the proper sense or not. We have to discuss this first before moving on to sources of law. Hopefully, we can start. I think I will need 2 more classes to discuss sources of international law, because most of the questions in the UGC NET exam, they come from sources of international law. Around 45% of the questions comes from sources of international law, which is a significant percentile. So I may have to go into very detail into the sources of international law, and we will see how far we can go. Okay, so let me start with the question whether international law is a law in the proper sense or not. So in the previous class, I have alluded to the definition given by John Austin with regard to this question, whether international law is a law or not. We have looked into John Austin's definition. Let me start the presentation first. 1 minute. Can anyone, Shalini, can you confirm whether the slide is visible or not?
Not yet, sir. It's not visible.
Uh, Okay, okay. I think it will take a little bit of time. So, I said,
Yeah, sir. It's visible.
eh, okay, okay, fine, fine. Okay, but unfortunately, I cannot see. Okay, fine. I think it's starting. Fine, fine, fine. Okay, let me start the PowerPoint presentation. Nature and basis of international law. That is what we are going to start before we start the sources of international law. So here what we will discuss whether international law is a law in the proper sense or not. Okay. So in here in that question whether international law is is a law is a law, in that particular question what we are going to discuss is whether there is a legislative organ to legislate under international law, whether international law has a judicial organ to make interpretations, whether it has an executive to enforce it, whether international law has a defined population who shall become the subjects of international law. So these are the questions that is being asked when someone asks whether international law is a proper law or not. Okay. Behind that question, what the question is trying to determine is whether international law has a proper legislative organ, whether international law has a judicial organ to interpret it, whether international law has an executive organ to enforce it, and whether international law has a definite population uh, to become its subjects. So what is happening here is international law is being compared to domestic law. Okay, so that is what is happening here. So let us go through the different dialogues with regard to this question. With regard to the question whether international law is a law or not, there are two answers. The one answer is international law is not a law in the proper sense, and the second opinion or second answer is international law is a law in the proper sense. So to the question whether international law is a law or not, there are two point of view. Rather than answers, these are point of views. They are perspectives. Okay, so we are going to discuss these perspectives, and I will leave it to you to decide whether international law is a law or not before going into the sources of international law. So the first point of view that we are going to discuss is international law is not a law in the proper sense. Okay, the first person that we are going to discuss here is John Austin. And I have alluded to John Austin while we were discussing about the definition of international law. John Austin, in his literature, The Province of Jurisprudence Determined, published in 1832. Please remember this literature written by John Austin. It will come as an option for international law as well as for jurisprudence in UGC net. Okay, so please note down The Province of Jurisprudence Determined, published in 1832 by John Austin. In this particular literature, John Austin, the point of view of John Austin with regard to law is that law must have a determined political superior, or it must have an authority uh, uh, which has power over a political inferior. Okay, so the law has to originate from a political superior who has the authority to govern another class of political inferiors. Okay. Now, that particular law that is emanating from a political superior, it must be backed by sanctions or coercion, or there should be a coercive enforcement agency. Okay. Then the third one is the third point of view of John Austin with regard to the definition of law is that people follow law because they fear that if they do not, they might be compelled or even punished for not following that particular law. So as you can see, these three elements that is mentioned by John Austin is absent in international law, especially during his time. Please note down the time period. It is 1832. There is no international court of justice. There is no United Nations organization. There is no WTO. There is no international entity or international community that we see today. Okay, this was in his time period. This may be true, somewhat true. Okay, so when you are looking into the definition, please keep in mind the time period. This was a point of view expressed by John Austin, 1832. If John Austin is born today, I would wonder whether he has the same opinion. That is, let us go through another jurist, Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes expressed his point of view with regard to international law in Leviathan. Leviathan it is the literature work of Thomas Hobbes, published in 1651. Again, please note down the time period. Again, Thomas Hobbes, while he was trying to define what constitutes law and why there is a law, he articulated the theory of social contract. According to the theory of social contract by Thomas Hobbes, he stated that before there was a social contract which created the law, there was the state of nature. Okay, there was the state of nature before human civilization. So in the state of nature prior to human civilization, which was created by social contract, man by nature is nasty, brutish, and violent. And in the state of nature, these qualities that was inherent in man, the qualities of nastiness, brutishness, and violence, it was very much augmented in the state of nature while men were living in forest. Okay, while we were living as hunter-gatherers, we were nasty, brutish, and violent. Fear or sanctions which were inherent in law is necessary. Okay, while and in order to escape from this nastiness or brutishness or violence of state of nature, every man entered into a social contract among themselves to create a particular sovereign who will govern over them. Okay, that is the social contract theory envisaged by Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, published in 1651. And in this point of view, in this contractual point of view of law, Thomas Hobbes states that fear or sanctions which are inherent in law is necessary to maintain order in society. Because why? Why? Because man is nasty, brutish, and violent. And only punishment or sanctions will inhibit these inherent negative qualities. Okay. Which is imposed by law, emanating from a sovereign which is created by the social contract existing among the citizens. Okay, so similar to John Austin, Thomas Hobbes also stated that there must be a sovereign, and this sovereign has to originate from a social contract among the people of a state. To create such a sovereign and to give him such powers to enact legislations and to enforce such legislations through coercion. Okay, so moving on to the next jurist, Thomas E. Holland. Thomas E. Holland, in Elements of Jurisprudence, published in 1880, defined international law as a vanishing point of jurisprudence. Again, he alluded to the absence of a definite legislature, absence of a definite judiciary, absence of a definite population to be governed under international law. Since all these three elements were absent, Thomas E. Holland, along the lines of John Austin and Thomas Hobbes, also considered international law as an improper law, and held that international law is a vanishing point of jurisprudence. And in the UGC exam, there may come a question: who held international law is a vanishing point of jurisprudence? And please remember, it is Thomas E. Holland, and he mentioned this statement or this point of view in Elements of Jurisprudence, published in 1880. Okay. Now coming to international law is a law in the proper sense. So here we are going into point of view expressed by different jurists who consider international law to be a proper law in the proper sense. Okay. So the first among them is Professor Oppenheimer, LFL Oppenheimer, and we have discussed about LFL Oppenheimer's definition of international law, which he expressed in his publication International Law, published in 1905 and subsequently revised in 1995 by Sir Arthur Jennings and Arthur Watts. Now, in Oppenheimer's point of view, he held that part of municipal law which is termed as unwritten or customary law. Okay, municipal law also contains law which is unwritten or they are customary law. Okay, municipal law not only contains law that is created by a particular sovereign. Municipal law not only contains law which is backed by sanctions. Municipal law will also contains customary law. As a matter of fact, majority of municipal law is made up of customary law. Okay, a classical example is the common law system, common law legal system. As you know, common law legal system is an uncodified, unwritten legal system. If you look into the Constitution of United Kingdom, you will not find a particular book titled the Constitution of United Kingdom. The Constitution of United Kingdom, it is an accumulation of different customary practices codified in different statutes and legislations. Predominantly, the common law is populated by precedents which acknowledge customary practices which existed in England. Okay, so the argument that there must be a sovereign, there must be a particular sovereign to enact legislations, and that particular legislations must be backed by sanctions, was first challenged by Oppenheimer. As you know, customary practices are followed voluntarily. There is no need for sanctions or punishments when it comes to enforcing customary law. Customary laws are followed voluntarily. Okay, there is no need for sanctions. And customary law, the author or the sovereign which enacted the customary law cannot be traced. Okay, so the argument that there is, since there is no sovereign or there is no sanctions to enforce in a legislation, it cannot be a law, it is invalid according to Oppenheimer. Okay, so another argument presented by Oppenheimer is no state in the world which could exist with written law only. That is another argument. Okay, another one is if any state violates any law, including international law, they try to justify those violations within international law. Okay, whenever there is an allegation of violation of international law, whether it is by North Korea, whether it is by China, whether it is by Russia, or for that matter, United States, they will always try to justify those violations by saying, by interpreting their actions and omissions under international law. No state will say that they do not recognize human rights, they do not recognize international law. They will always say whatever they have done, whatever the allegation is, it is justified under international law. So it indicates that nation states recognize international law as a law in the proper sense. Okay. Another one is Sir Henry Maine, who considers international law as a law in the proper sense. In primitive society, according to Henry Maine, in primitive society there was no sovereign or political authority, yet there were laws. Okay, in the primitive society. In primitive society, particularly, you look into tribal society. Tribal society, they do not have a Bible. they do not have a Quran, they do not have a Bhagavad Gita, or they do not have an Indian penal code. Okay. In tribal societies, they even though there was no sovereign, no authority, there were law. It Sir Henry Maine is indicating to customary law. Okay. If one accepts the Austin definition, John Austin's definition of law, common law cannot be recognized as a legal system, valid legal system. That was the point of view expressed by Henry Maine. Okay. Now coming on to HLA Hart. HLA Hart, the concept of law, published in 1994, second edition. Concept of law by positive moralists plainly approximate closer to penal statutes, okay, enacted by legislature of modern states than any other variety of law. Okay, so in other words, HLA Hart is saying that the point of view expressed by positivists are a class of jurists who say who consider international law to be a improper law. Okay, that includes John Austin, Thomas Hobbes, and Holland. Okay, and all of them are trying to narrow down the definition of law into a penal statute. Okay. There are other different types of statutes other than penal statutes. There are civil laws. There are civil laws and the petty laws, which are not most of the time backed by sanctions. Okay. So that is HLA Hart. Then coming to Frederick Pollock. Pollock, in his Sources of International Law, there was an article published by Sir Frederick Pollock, Sources of International Law, published in 1908. The only essential condition for existence of law is the existence of a political community. That is according to Sir Frederick Pollock. And recognition of its members of settled rules binding upon them in that capacity. Okay. So Frederick Pollock is saying that as long as there is a political community that is in existence, there will be law. Okay. And what do you mean by a political community? The political community here under international law, according to Sir Frederick Pollock, is the community of nation states. Okay, a community of nation states do exist, and they constitute the political community for international law. And this political community considers international law to be a law in the proper sense, and that is sufficient enough to consider international law as a law in the proper sense. That is according to Sir Frederick Pollock. That is the point of view expressed by him in the Sources of International Law, which he published in 1908. Okay. Now coming back to R.W.M. Dias, in his literature, The Jurisprudence, published in 1964, he says that the principal reason why states obey international law appears to be fear and self-interest. That is the point of R.W.M. Dias. Fear operates through war, reprisal, restoration, Pacific blockade, and naval military demonstrations. Okay, so nations obey international law because of fear, because of uprisal, because of war, the possibility of going into war with another nation. Because of the fear, nations do tend to follow international law. So R.W. Dias is saying that it is wrong to say that there is no sanctions or coercive element in international law. It is wrong to say that there is no enforcement mechanism under international law. Okay, the point of view expressed by John Austin is wrong. That is what R.W.M. Dias is trying to say. Please remember the year when in which his literature was published. It is in 1964. So it is well within the modern period. And in this modern period, we know that whenever a state is unwilling to follow international law, there is war, reprisal, restoration, Pacific blockade, and naval military demonstrations to force that particular nation to follow international law. We will discuss about settlement of international dispute by peaceful means as well as through coercive means. That is a particular syllabus that is coming under UGC NET exam, and that we will discuss these different methods in detail in the coming classes. Okay. Now, international law is not a law in the proper sense. Whether there is any examples to point towards any provisions which demonstrates that international law is not a law in the proper sense. If you look into, one can say international law is not a law in the proper sense if you look into the provisions of the UN Charter. Okay, that is the argument presented by John Austin. You can say that argument presented by John Austin may be true. The reason why, because if you look into Article 2 Clause 1 of the UN Charter, you will see that Article 2 Clause 1 says the United Nations organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality. Okay, sovereign equality of all its members. Okay, in other words, the principle of sovereign equality means no state is above or below another state. Okay, every state is equal. There is no hierarchy of states. That is what is meant by sovereign equality. And one may say that, therefore, the argument presented by John Austin that there is no particular sovereign under international law is true. There is no particular sovereign under international law because each and every state is equal under international law, under the principle of sovereign equality. If you look into Article 2 Clause 4 of the UN Charter, you will see that it states all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner that is inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of United Nations. So, Article 2 Clause 4 is trying to say about respecting the internal affairs of a state. Okay. In other words, one state cannot interfere in the internal affairs of another state. And the question comes, if members of the international community cannot interfere in the internal matters of a state, how can it enforce international law? How can one enforce international law? That is the question. So again, the question of particular sovereignty, a sovereign to enforce international law is posed by Article 2 Clause 1, and the question of enforceability is posed by Article 2 Clause 4 of the UN Charter. Okay, these provisions support the argument that international law is not a law in the proper sense, because Article 2 Clause 1 says that there is no particular sovereign to enforce international law because of principles of sovereign equality. There cannot be an enforcement mechanism because Article 2 Clause 4 calls for refraining from interfering in the internal matters of another state. So now coming to legal provisions which exhibit that international law is a law in the proper sense. What are the legal provisions that are there which demonstrates that international law is a law in the proper sense? If you look into Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter speaks about the powers of the Security Council to maintain or restore international peace and security. If you read the preamble of the UN Charter, the main objective of United Nations organization is to maintain international peace and security. And if you go into Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, you will see that if there is any threat to international peace and security or aggression has taken place, the Security Council can take necessary action to maintain or restore international peace and security. Okay, that is provided. I believe it is provided under Article 47 or 45. So, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter enables the Security Council to take appropriate action. The Security Council under Chapter 7 can create its own military force to engage in war or any economic sanctions or military sanctions against another state to enforce international law in order to maintain international peace and security. Okay, that is it. So Chapter 7 of the UN Charter established a particular sovereign or an enforcement mechanism. Okay, so one cannot say that there is no enforcement mechanism. The Chapter 7 of the UN Charter provides an enforcement mechanism to enforce international law whenever there is a possibility of violation leading to infringement of international peace and security. And going to, if you look into Article 59 of the ICJ Statute, Article 59 and 94, Article 59 of the ICJ Statute says that the decision of the International Court of Justice is binding upon the parties to the dispute. That is Article 59 of the ICJ Statute. If you look into Article 94 of the UN Charter, it provides that if any party to the dispute, that is any party to the dispute that has appeared before the ICJ, does not follow the decision of the International Court of Justice, the aggrieved party, okay, the other party may approach the Security Council, which can take necessary action to enforce the decision of the International Court of Justice. Okay, so again it established that there is a particular judiciary to interpret international law, and whenever the interpretation of international law is not obeyed, there is an enforcement mechanism under Article 94 of the UN Charter, empowering the Security Council to take necessary action to enforce the decision of ICJ. Okay, so these provisions of the UN Charter also demonstrates that, also support the point of view that international law is a proper law in the proper sense. Okay, so please remember, these are point of views which are still disputed. Okay, these are subjective point of view, and there is a need for an objective analysis. If you go by objective analysis, we will see that we will see that the international law is a law in the proper sense, because you see, if you go into Article 2 Clause 4 of the UN Charter, you go into Article 2 Clause 4 of the UN Charter, where it says that the members of the UN has undertaken that they shall respect the territorial integrity and political independence of each other, and shall not use force against each other. The only exception is given under Article 51, that is the Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which confers on the members the right of individual and collective self-defense. Okay. In other words, whenever another state infringe on the internal national territorial integrity of a particular state, or whenever a particular state has violated international law, the aggrieved state can go for individual or collective defense. An example of a collective defense is the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. I hope all of you are very well aware of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is a classical example of a collective self-defense. Okay, so if you make an objective analysis of the provisions of the UN Charter, we have to see that international law is a law in the proper sense. Or we can say that in the modern period, we have sufficient infrastructure, sufficient institutions in place to consider international law as a law in the proper sense. It is not like in the 19th and 18th century. In the 21st century, we have all the measures necessary to enforce and interpret and even to legislate international law. Okay. Now, another argument that I would like to make is, this argument is made by Sir Frederick Pollock. Okay, Sir Frederick Pollock made one statement. Despite the fact that there is a legislature, there is a judiciary, there is a law enforcement mechanism, that is, there is an executive to enforce domestic law, there is still violation of domestic law. Okay, there is still violation of domestic law or unwillingness among the people to follow law. Okay, even regardless of the fact there is a judiciary, there is a legislature, there is an executive within domestic law. One cannot say that all the domestic laws are followed by all the people. Okay, there is instances of violation of domestic law within each and every country, similar to international law. Okay, International law is also violated. International law is also violated. International law has a legislature, it has a judiciary. The legislature of an international law can be, we can say the United Nations General Assembly is a legislature. Then there is a WTO General Assembly, there is a General Assembly, General Council of the World Trade Organization. And there are also the member councils of the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, where nation states comes together and pass resolutions. And through these resolutions, they make law. There is a legislature. Now, when it comes to judiciary, there is International Court of Justice, ICJ. There is the International Court of Arbitration. There is the WTO Dispute Settlement Mechanism. There is the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea. So there are judiciaries to interpret the law, and there are executive institutions to enforce international law. The examples would be the Security Council of the United Nations. We also have the Secretariat of the WTO, Secretariat of the IMF, and IBRD. All these are executive bodies put in place to enforce international law coming under the respective international organizations. So, in other words, we can conclude that international law is a law in the proper sense. Okay. Now, coming to the basis of international law, what is the foundation of international law? Since we have agreed that there is a large increasing consensus that international law is a law in the proper sense, the next thing that we need to discuss is what are the basis of international law. Okay. Now, there are different theories which tries to discuss the foundation or basis of international law. One of those theories is the theory of law of nature. Okay, theories as to the law of nature is one of the first theories which tries to discuss the basis of international law. So there are different theories. Each theories express a different point of view from a class of jurists. Okay, these are point of view. These are subjective point of view, and you will see that all these points of view are true. Okay. They are different points of view, and each of these points of view are true in their own way. So the first point of view that we will discuss is the point of view on the basis of international law expressed in the theory as to the law of nature. Okay. In other words, it is known as the natural law theory of international law. According to the natural law theory, the basis of international law, or the reason why international law is followed by nation states and other members of the international community, is because states submit to international law because their relations were regulated by higher law, the law of nature, of which international law was but a part. In other words, according to the law of nature, there is a law which is omnipotent and omnipresent. Okay, and this omnipotent and omnipresent law which exists across the universe, it is known as natural law. And natural law, it is discovered by human reasoning, human rationality. And according to the natural law theory, all man-made law are derived from natural law. All man-made law must be in accordance with natural law. Okay. So international law is followed because international law represents universal common values, okay, which are discovered by human rationality. That is the point of natural law theory of international law. Okay. A classical example would be, before I give you the examples of natural law, the supporters of the natural law theory of international law is Hugo Grotius, Emmerich de Wettel, and Pufendorf. Okay, then Christian Thermius. So please note down these different jurists. Okay, Important jurist who supported the natural theory of international law is Hugo Grotius, Vettel, then Christian Thomasius. Okay, these three jurists were the then along with Pufendorf. Okay, Pufendorf, please remember, and also please note down the literature. Hugo Grotius in De Jure Belli Ac Per Se, that is translated as Law on War and Peace, published in 1625. Then Emmerich de Vettel, in his publication Droit des Gens, published in 1758. Then Pufendorf on the Right of War and Peace, published in 1625. Then Christian Thomasius, who is the son of Pufendorf, he published the Institutions of Jurisprudence, the Institutions of Divine Jurisprudence, published in 1688. Okay, so all the four jurists that I have mentioned here, they are considered as the founding members of the theory of law of nature on international law. According to this theory, international law originates from a universal law which exists across the universe. Okay, a natural law which exists across the universe, which is not made but discovered. These laws are discovered by human rationality. Okay, human beings are imbibed with the rationality, and through this rationality we discover these universal law which exist across all countries. Okay, and examples of this universal law includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR 1945, International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR 1966, International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, ICESCR 1966, Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, CEDAW, in other words, CEDAW, 1979, Convention on Rights of Children, 1989. Okay, all these conventions are a classical example of natural law. Okay, and international law cannot violate these laws. Okay, while making international law, while making any international law for that matter, these particular natural laws cannot be violated. Okay, any international law which violates any of these natural law, it is not a international law in the proper sense. Okay, that is the natural theory of international law, and these are the examples. And all these conventions we will study in detail while we go through through the international human rights law. International human rights law is part of the UGC NET syllabus, and we will discuss this different conventions in detail in coming classes. Okay, for the time being, please remember these are the classical examples of natural law theory. Okay, classical examples of natural law existing within international law. Another one would be another international conventions that I have mentioned is the first Geneva Convention, second, third, and fourth Geneva Conventions. All these Geneva Conventions, they try to regulate law of war, or other words, humanitarian law. I have also already mentioned to you about public international law being divided into law of peace and law of war. And the law of war, or otherwise known as humanitarian law, it is codified into the 4 different Geneva Conventions. Okay, we will discuss these Geneva Conventions in detail while we study about the law of the refugee law. Okay, refugee law and humanitarian law, that is also part of UGC NET syllabus. For the time being, please remember, even during war, natural law cannot be violated. Okay, even during war, natural law cannot be violated, and the natural laws which cannot be violated even during war are codified under the first, second, third, and fourth Geneva Convention. If you look into the first Geneva Convention, it speaks about protection of wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. Okay, if you look into the second Geneva Convention, it speaks about protection of the wounded, sick soldiers on the sea. Okay, the first Geneva Convention protects wounded soldiers on land, The second Geneva Convention protects wounded soldiers on the sea. The third Geneva Convention protects the rights of prisoners of war in general. Okay, and the fourth Geneva Convention protects certain fundamental rights of civilians who are trapped in war zones. Okay, so all these four Geneva Conventions grant certain rights to soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilians who are trapped in war zones. And it implies that even during war, certain principles of law of nature cannot be violated, and that is recognized under international law in terms of humanitarian law. So these are the examples. Again, another example that I would like to mention is conventions relating to status of stateless persons. Conventions on the reduction of statelessness. So these both conventions are very important conventions when it comes to refugees. And while we will study in detail these two conventions when we discuss about refugee law in the upcoming classes. Okay. For the time being, please note down these conventions and their particular year. Okay. Now, criticism of natural law theory is, you see, even though natural law theory says the natural law cannot be violated by man-made law, there are instances of natural law being violated by man-made law, and such instances include Article 27 of the UN Charter, where Article 27 of the UN Charter grants veto power to the permanent members of the United Nations. Okay, and we have seen many of you may be aware of the fact that when it comes to protecting human rights and humanitarian law, committed humanitarian law, when many states violate human rights and humanitarian law, there is a failure on the side of the United Nations to take appropriate enforcement mechanisms under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter because of the veto power that is available to the permanent members of the UN Charter. That is United Kingdom, United States, France, Russia, and China can veto any of the resolutions that is passed by the General Assembly or other members of the UN Security Council. Okay, that is provided under Article 27. And this veto power undermines the law of nature that is recognized under international law, where we have to say that international law is preceded by a national interest or a geopolitical interest. Okay, so natural law is not always respected or enforced under international law. And the classical example is the veto power that is available to the permanent members of the United Nations under Article 27 of the UN Charter. Okay. Now coming to the positivist theory. Positivist theory is another point of view of international law on the basis of international law. Why international law is followed? Okay. The basis of international law, according to the positive theory, the positivist theory is an antithesis to the natural law theory of international law. According to the positivist theory, international law is followed by nation states by surrendering their sovereignty. Okay, there are a few jurists who support the positivist theory. If you look into Hegel says that international law is the natural consent of the state. Without the consent of the state, no law can bind the state. This consent may be expressed or implied. That is according to Hegel. So, in order for international law to exist, the nation states must consent to following that particular international law, and this particular consent may be expressed or implied. It may be expressed when that consent is expressed through a multilateral treaty or a bilateral treaty. When nations are entering into multilateral treaty or bilateral treaty, we can say that the consent to follow international law is expressed. Okay. When nation states are following a customary practice, when nation states are following an international law by actions and omissions. Okay. A classical example would be, a classical example would be diplomatic immunities. Okay, diplomatic privileges. when a sovereign of a state comes to the territory of another state, the particular sovereign, even if that particular sovereign has committed a crime, he will not be arrested or punished by the state in whose territory that particular sovereign has committed a crime. That is diplomatic immunities. And these diplomatic immunities have been recognized, or the principles of diplomatic relations under international law has been recognized from time immemorial as a customary practice. Okay, so when it comes to diplomatic relations, diplomatic protocols, they are all impliedly consented by states. Okay, that is the point of view of Hegel, and it was mentioned by him in the Phenomenology of Spirit, which was published by Hegel in 1807. Okay, coming to J.G. Stock. J.G. Stock says international law can, in logic, be reduced to a system of rules depending for their validity only on the fact that states have consented to them. Okay, again, Stock is speaking about consent. Unless and until states consent to international law cannot exist. Okay, again, it was expressed by J.G. Stock in Introduction to International Law. Okay, please remember, international law in logic be reduced to a system of rules. So international law contains rules. Okay, rules for consenting to follow international law. Okay, it contains rules and procedures where states consent to follow international law, or states express their consent to follow international law. Now, coming to J.L. Brierley, according to Brierley, the doctrine of positivism teaches that international law is a sum rule by which states have consented to be bound. Again, rules. So international law is a codification of rules by which points towards the actions and omissions that must be taken by states to consent to international law. Okay. Then Binkershoek. The basis of international law is the natural consent of state, without which international law cannot exist. Okay. Now, examples of positivist theory is the veto power itself. The veto power of the permanent members of the Security Council is a classical example of positivist theory. Whenever the permanent member of the Security Council is exercising the veto power, that particular state is expressly making their statement that they are not willing to consent to the decision made by the UN Security Council, or they are not willing to consent to any of the international law made by the United Nations organization. Okay, veto power is another example of positivism. Without the consent, there will be no international law. Veto power is classical example. The procedure for obtaining consent of legislature of a state who represents the will of its people in ratification of any treaty. So, if you take India as an example, whenever an Indian diplomat is going to an international conference and negotiating an international treaty, before they can ratify a particular treaty, particular provisions of the treaty must be tabled before the Indian Parliament. Unless and until the Indian Parliament gives a consent to that provisions of that particular international treaty, the ratification of the international treaty will not have any basis for under the domestic law of India. Okay, that we will discuss when we study about the steps involved in ratification of a treaty. The law of treaty we will discuss when we are discussing the different sources of law, international law. Okay, so in order to ratify a treaty, international treaty, the provisions of the international treaty must be tabled before the parliament or the legislature of a particular state. Unless and until the legislature grants an assent, a particular international treaty will not be considered as part of domestic law. Okay, that is another example of positivist theory. The positivist theory in practice. Okay, criticism of positivist theory. What is the criticism of positivist theory? Okay, if you look into the provisions of international law, there are some laws which are binding on states irrespective of their consent. Okay, there are some laws which are binding on the states irrespective of their consent. A classical example is uh, the Vienna Convention of Law Treaty. Okay, Vienna Convention of Law Treaty recognized this fact. If you read Article 36 of the Vienna Convention of Law Treaty, 1969, you will see that it says it says that the provisions of a treaty may be binding on third parties even if they are not consent to it. Okay, even if they have not consented to a particular treaty, they will be party to that treaty. A classical example is the UN Charter itself. The UN Charter, the principles of the UN Charter is also applicable to members states who are not members of the United Nations. Okay, there is a particular provision. For the time being, I cannot recollect it. I believe it is article. I believe it is article 12, I believe, which says even if a particular state is not party to the UN Charter, the principles of the UN Charter is also applicable to that particular state, and that the particular state will be made to follow the principles of UN Charter through the UN Security Council. Okay. So the UN Charter is also a classical example. Even if a particular state is not a party to the UN Charter, the UN Charter is applicable to that particular state also. Now, theory of consent. There is also another other theories. Other theories of theories which tries to explain the basis of international law. It is a different point of view of natural law theory and positivist theory. Another one is the theory of consent. Theory of consent is another point of view of the positivist theory. Theory of consent basically says states observe rules of international law because they have to give their implied consent for it. Okay. The theory of consent is propounded by Ancelotti. Ancelotti expressed the theory of consent in International Law course, which is a literature which is published by him. International Law course, volume 3, published in 1950. The theory of consent is also expressed by Heinrich Streipel. Heinrich Streipel also expressed the theory of consent in International Law and National Law, International Law and National Law, published in 1899. Oppenheimer also supported the theory of consent in his International Law, published in 1905. Not 1909. Okay, I made a small. I believe 1909. Sorry, 1909. Correct. So theory of consent is another point of view of positivist theory of law, international law. So another one is auto limitation theory. Auto limitation theory is another permutation of positive theory. And according to the auto limitation theory, international law is binding upon states because they have restricted their powers through the process of auto limitation, and they have agreed to abide by international law. So in other words, auto limitation theory is saying that whenever a state, international law comes into existence, international law comes into existence as a result of surrendering sovereignty of a particular state. Okay, whenever a state surrender its sovereignty, international law comes into existence. You take the example of diplomatic immunity. Okay, you are giving a particular diplomat coming from a foreign state immunity from criminal persecution. Okay, when you're giving an immunity from criminal persecution or civil persecution, you are surrendering your sovereignty to punish that particular diplomat under penal law or civil law. Okay, so the law of diplomacy has came about by surrendering certain sovereign powers of a hosting state. By surrendering the sovereign power to punish under a criminal law, by surrendering the sovereign power to punish under civil law, a diplomatic immunity or a law of diplomacy is created under international law. That is a classical example of auto limitation theory. Please remember, auto limitation theory says international law comes about by surrendering state sovereignty. Whenever you surrender state sovereignty, international law comes into existence. Okay, that is auto limitation theory. Now, another theory is pacta sunt servanda theory, and this particular pacta sunt servanda theory is propounded by D. Ancelotti. Okay, D. Ancelotti. Uh, I made a small spelling mistake. It is not Dancelotti. It is D. Ancelotti. Ancelotti is an Italian jurist, and in his publication International Law Course Volume 3, published in 1950, he propounded the pacta sunt servanda theory as the basis for international law, for explaining why international law is followed by nation states. According to this theory, the binding force of international law is based on the supreme fundamental norms or principles known as pacta sunt servanda. This pacta sunt servanda means that agreements entered into by states will be respected and followed by them in good faith. Okay, that is what is meant by pacta sunt servanda. Okay, pacta sunt servanda. So international law represents a culmination of agreements entered into by states followed by them in good faith. That is the theory of pacta sunt servanda, trying to explain the basis of international law, propounded by Ancelotti, an Italian jurist, in his publication International Law Course, Volume 3, published in 1950. Okay. Now, the theory of fundamental rights. The theory of fundamental rights is parallel to the theory of natural law, theory of international law. So, if you look into the theory of fundamental rights, it says that before the existence of state, man used to live in a natural state and possesses some fundamental rights such as right to independence, equality, self-preservation, etc. It is contended that, like man, state also possesses fundamental rights, because so far there is no world authority over and above the state. Okay, that is the theory of fundamental rights, and the supporters of fundamental rights are the same as the supporters of the natural law theory of international law. Okay, so I hope you understood. Here, fundamental rights theory is trying to say, just like how each and every individual men and women were born with fundamental rights which are inalienable, inherent and inalienable. And those inalienable rights include right to independence, equality, self-preservation, etc. Just like that, since nation states are a community of men and women, nation states also possesses certain fundamental rights. And in order to enforce these fundamental rights, international law has come about. Okay, or international law is a recognition of these fundamental rights. So that international law is recognized and followed because nation states recognize among each other these fundamental rights. Okay, that is the theory of fundamental rights, which tries to explain the basis of international law. Okay, now this is the end of a class trying to determine whether international law is a law in the proper sense or not. Now